follow suit.
Okay. Thanks. It's time to move this debate to the left where it belongs. In understanding the symbolism of Barack Obama's African connections, it's essential that we revisit his African heritage. His elegant 1995 memoir, Dreams from My Father, describes a painful quest for identity and a vulnerability triggered by the death of a Kenyan father who had left the family when Obama was only 2 years old. During his visit of self-discovery to Kenya as a 26-year-old, Obama meets his large extended family and makes connections between black Americans in Chicago ghettos, as well as Kenyans in dirt-poor Nairobi shantytowns. None of the previous 43 American presidents of European ancestry could have recounted such an experience, which is what made Obama's ascent to the White House of such interest to Africa. As a US Senator, Obama also visited Kenya, South Africa, and Chad in 2006. I was in fact at the lecture he gave in Cape Town. In Kenya, his condemnation of human rights abuses and corruption in Africa were widely applauded. And as a student in the US also, Obama had come of age. He'd come to political consciousness by being involved in the anti-apartheid struggles. In South Africa during his visit, he met with Nelson Mandela, one of his heroes, and also criticized the then president, Thabo Mbeki's AIDS policies. But despite his obvious identification with Africa, as president, Obama has other pressing policy priorities: the domestic economy, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, China, North Korea, the Middle East. We know that he has a large in-tray, which have taken precedence over the continent. There is also still a lack of a powerful, cohesive domestic constituency on Africa in the US, which can wield the influence of the Israel lobby. Israel still receives $3 billion a year in aid from the US. Egypt receives $2 billion to remain friends with Israel as well still. And 49 sub-Saharan African countries, some of the poorest in the world, receive typically less than $1 billion a year. So the figures we've been hearing from Erica are really very little, a drop in the ocean when you consider what the needs are and when you compare it to what others are getting. It shows you how political US aid is, to start with. The Congressional Black Caucus also currently has only one senator who's filling a seat out of 100, and 39 out of 435 members of the US House of Representatives. Obama visited Ghana in July 2009, noting in his address to the Parliament, "I have the blood of Africa within me." And in his sometimes hectoring message, he of course reiterated what Erica had said, strong institutions rather than strong men, and identified the 4 pillars of US Africa policy: democracy, economic growth, health and education, and managing conflicts. Johnny Carson, an experienced African-American former ambassador to Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Uganda, was appointed as Obama's Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in 2009. And this author encountered Carson at the African Studies Association meeting in New Orleans in 2009, where he delivered a speech on US policy towards Africa. This address could easily have been delivered by any official of the George W. Bush administration. It was disappointing in its disingenuous and ahistorical portrayal of US policy towards Africa, glossing over damaging American actions and exaggerating apparent successes in areas like trade and security. The Assistant Secretary of State incredibly expressed surprise to the audience that Angola was not a breadbasket for Africa, conveniently forgetting that his own country had fueled a civil war for 3 decades in which Washington had supported a psychopathic warlord called Jonas Savimbi as part of its ideological Cold War struggles. Carson then invited scholars in attendance to assist the US in its efforts on Africa. This was one of the worst sales pitches I had ever seen, and left me wondering whether more attention should not be paid to exposing African American policymakers who peddle such destructive views about Africa. I also wondered whether such individuals were using a false solidarity with the continent to the great detriment of Africa in order to further their own political careers. During the recent election in Kenya in March 2013, Carson clumsily intervened by warning Kenyans that actions have consequences, which may have helped boost support for the victory of the ICC indictee, Uhuru Kenyatta. So it basically probably had the opposite effect. Another African American whom Erica worked closely with, US Ambassador at the UN, Susan Rice, has also often been an abrasive presence on the UN Security Council, having reportedly opposed any US intervention during the Rwandan genocide in 1994 as a National Security Council official. Her credibility is not particularly high on the continent, despite the many crocodile tears she shed over Darfur. And her ill-advised push recently to lift the arms embargo on the government in Somalia will surely exacerbate, not improve, the powder keg that is the Horn of Africa. Obama has continued several of the truculent George Bush's most egregious policies on the continent, many of which have in fact militarized US foreign policy towards Africa. Extraordinary rendition of terror suspects to be tortured in North Africa did continue. 1,500 US soldiers remain in Djibouti to track terrorists in the region. Autocratic regimes in oil-rich Gabon and Equatorial Guinea remain staunch US clients, and officials of the US Africa Command are still roaming the continent in search of enemies. America's East Africa Counterterrorism Initiative continues to provide training and equipment in Ethiopia and Kenya. There's the Pan-Sahel Initiative that continues to work with the autocratic regimes in Mauritania and Chad. The Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Initiative also continues to try to build the capacity of several African armies, Algeria, Morocco, Nigeria, Niger, etc. And the Obama administration has recently deployed drones in Niger. AFRICOM, which was strongly championed by Donald Rumsfeld, the discredited former defense secretary of Bush, was ostensibly meant to strengthen Washington's military cooperation with Africa. This intervention, or this initiative, has instead further increased America's prioritization of militaristic anti-terrorist approaches. Under Obama, AFRICOM now costs $300 million a year, and nearly 100 training programs and exercises are being conducted in 35 African countries. This militarized approach in Africa, as some within the State Department even have noted, has basically downgraded things like democratic governance, development and health, which get less priority because the Pentagon, which has a lot more money than state, is driving many of these policies. And despite what was said about PEPFAR, Obama actually drastically has cut AIDS funding to Africa by $200 million in 2012. And this was one of the few successes of the George Bush administration, putting real money, $15 billion, into these programs for Africa and other countries in the Caribbean and elsewhere. AFRICOM was involved in the early stages of the NATO-led campaign in Libya in 2011. It's focusing on tracking terrorists in Mali and Libya, combating piracy on the Gulf of Guinea, narco-trafficking, and we've heard that it was deployed also to track Joseph Kony in the Great Lakes. More positively, Washington provided $355 million to the AU mission in Somalia, but this is a mission that should be sensibly brought under the UN's control. Many African armies have also complained that they need more logistics and equipment and not just counterterrorism training that the US is providing. And in the current Mali conflict, Washington has now sensibly supported the deployment of a UN peacekeeping mission, but it actually has quite a lot of explaining to do in this particular case. It spent $41 million between 2009 and 2012 training the coup leaders in Mali, including its meddling leader, Captain Amadou Sanogo. Johnny Carson's obsessive push for elections also as soon as possible also seems to be misguided, with a country where the north still is full of rebels in the mountain and desert territory, and a weak government has no effective army that's under civilian control. So as he arrogantly did in Kenya, Carson has brushed aside the widespread skepticism of the Malian population for stability before they can actually organize elections. In North Africa, in June 2009, Obama delivered a speech in Cairo in which he spoke out forcefully for democratic values in Islamic countries, but then diluted his message by arguing that, and I quote, "each nation gives life to the principle in its own way." His administration continued to support Mubarak's regime with $1 billion a year, but clearly fearing the uncertainty of a possible Islamist takeover in Cairo, he spoke out of both sides of his mouth in the 2011 crisis until it became clear that the political wind was blowing the way of the protesters. Just before Tunisia's 23-year tyranny of Ben Ali was toppled in 2011, the Obama administration had approved $12 million in military aid to this autocratic regime. One is often sympathetic to Obama's plight in view of the bad faith of his strident and often deeply prejudiced opponents in the US. A third of Republicans incredibly believe he's a Muslim. A quarter of them stubbornly believe the Kenyan Kansan president was not born in the US despite his birth certificate irrefutably saying so. So Obama has been obstructed at every turn by Republicans. I have no question about that. And the racism that still afflicts American society has scarcely dissipated with the historic election of the first black president. But such prejudice must never stop us from, as Edward Said implored, speaking truth to power. According to The Economist, in his first year in office, Obama had ordered targeted assassinations of terror suspects through an average of one drone attack a week into Pakistan and Afghanistan, resulting in the killing of hundreds of innocent women and children. Ironically, by the time he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, Obama had sent more drones than Bush had unleashed during his entire 8 years in office. Rather than winning hearts and minds with these policies, the drones that are still going into Somalia and other places are actually providing more terrorists. I'll round up now. So to influence US policy towards Africa in Obama's second term, it's important that pro-Africa lobbyists work closely with progressive legislators in the US Congress and Washington-based interest groups, as was done with apartheid in the 1980s. There are tens of thousands of highly educated Africans who can be called upon to do this. We need also more substantive and consistent support for the role of the UN peacekeeping in Africa and genuine capacity building for African regional organizations and not just rhetoric. The agricultural subsidies, billions of dollars of them, that are being given to gluttonous US farmers that are choking them, must also be eliminated, because if you talk about wanting to help African farmers, that is the biggest thing by far that you can do. So despite the pretty poetry during the 2008 presidential campaign by the most cosmopolitan and worldly individual to occupy the White House, Obama has so far ruled in pragmatic prose. A line in Obama's 2009 Nobel Prize speech may unwittingly provide what could well become the epitaph to his presidency. And I quote, "Even those of us with the best intentions will at times fail to right the wrongs before us." Barack's instincts to be a force for good in the world have often been diverted by his country's imperial temptations. The road to hell is famously paved with the best intentions. Thank you.